right. Well, today we're continuing our series that we've been in for the last several weeks called Here's Your Sign. And if this is your first time with us or your first time back in a while, we know for sure we didn't cover this last week because I was out. And so let me just kind of recap a little bit of where we've been. We've been walking through John's gospel. And John is the man who was one of 12 of Jesus' closest followers while he was here on earth. And several of these followers wrote down what they personally saw, what they personally witnessed Jesus say and do. And John, what he did is he actually wrote down the purpose for which he wrote all the stuff down that he saw Jesus say and do. And so we saw this is really the theme verse or verses for this whole series, and we saw it the first couple weeks, and I just wanted us to see it again. He writes it at the end of his book and the recording of what Jesus said and did. He tells us why he did it. And so I just want to recap that again. John 20, verse 30 and 31 says this. It should be on the screen behind me, that Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. So that's the first thing is, hey, Jesus did a whole lot of other stuff. John goes on to say, if I were to have recorded everything Jesus said and did, you couldn't even fill all the books in the world with it. He just did a lot of things. It would be like if somebody followed your every move throughout your whole life. I mean, that's a lot. But so John acknowledges that that he did all these things, but these signs that John recorded, these are written for one purpose, so that you who were not there with him in the moment, that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That's why John wrote it down. And what we've seen about these signs as we've been going through each week is that these signs were historical events. These weren't made up fairy tales. These weren't once upon a time fairy tales. These were historical events. They always happened in public. They didn't happen in a closet where nobody was around. They happened in public. And they were miraculous. So the things that John wrote down that Jesus did, these signs that he did for the purpose of showing you who Jesus is so that you might believe and find life in his name, these were miraculous. These were not done by just an ordinary person. An ordinary person couldn't have done these things. And we've seen each week of this series the things that Jesus did. We started with Jesus seeing that he turned water into wine. That was the first sign that revealed who he was. Then we saw that he healed a royal official's son. We saw that he healed a man that had been an invalid or paralyzed for 38 years. We saw that Jesus took 5 loaves and 2 fish and multiplied it to where 5,000 men were fed, which means it was more like 15 to 20,000 total people. He was able to do that. And then today, we're going to look at the 5th sign. And the 5th sign that we are going to look at today is found in John chapter 6. In fact, it comes immediately after the 4th sign that we saw 2 weeks ago. It comes immediately after Jesus feeds the 5,000. I mean, the very next thing that happens in the gospel accounts that record this sign, it happens right after. And what happened about the sign 2 weeks ago that we looked at when Jesus fed the 5,000, we saw that this is the only sign that John records that all 4 of the eyewitness accounts of Jesus, the biographical accounts of Jesus, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that was the only sign that all 4 of them recorded. Well, today, the 5th sign we're going to look at, 3 of them recorded, John, Mark, and Matthew. All right, so it's still a significant one to at least 3 out of 4 of them. But for sure, this was the 5th sign that revealed who Jesus was. And this sign took place in a region of Israel called the Galilee. It's in the northern part of Israel, okay? This is where the last sign took place as well, because again, it comes right after, so he hasn't traveled too far at all. But this has to do with the Sea of Galilee. Today's sign has to do with the Sea of Galilee. And I want to take a little bit of time and talk about the Sea of Galilee because the Sea of Galilee is quite unique. It also goes by sometimes the Lake of Gennesaret or Lake Tiberias, okay? It has different names. And it's about 13 miles in length, about 7 or 8 miles wide. It's about 140 to 150 feet deep, depending upon where you are on the lake, all right? But what's really cool about this lake is it is the lowest lake in the world fresh water. All right, so the lowest freshwater lake in the world, meaning below sea level. It's 600 to 700 feet below sea level. There's no other lake, freshwater lake in the world that is at a lower elevation. Okay, so it's 600 to 700 feet below sea level. It's just kind of some unique facts about it. And I've been to the Sea of Galilee. In 2017, I went to Israel. And I just want you to know, the Sea of Galilee, there's something unique about it. Jesus loved it. He did so much of his ministry in and around the Sea of Galilee and in the region of the Galilee. But it is, without a doubt, the most peaceful place I've ever been. And I'm not saying that to try to spiritualize what we're about to talk about or to make you think, oh, wow, there's something. Like, there is something about it, but it's just so peaceful. And when you realize that so much of Jesus' ministry centered around it, and that you are there in a historical place where Jesus was, and there's just something when you go out on the boat on the Sea of Galilee, and you see it, and you experience it, and you look around, and you take it in, it's just peaceful. It's just peaceful. But the Sea of Galilee is not always peaceful. And that's what we're going to see today. So Jesus has just fed the 5,000, okay? He's just fed the 5,000. And as we saw a couple weeks ago, Jesus is realizing what's in the hearts of these people. They're not after him as the bread of life. They're after him as bread maker. They just want him to do another trick. They're after him as prophet, not falling down before him as Son of God, all right? And so Jesus, knowing what's in their heart, he goes away into the mountains to pray. That's what Jesus does in this moment. He separates himself from the crowd. But Matthew tells us that he sent the disciples on ahead of him to go get into the boats to go to the other side. Remember, we have three accounts of three different perspectives of what happened in these moments when the signs are in each of these gospel accounts. Well, this we have in Matthew. He tells us that what happened is that Jesus sends them on so he could go pray. But Luke, he just tells us this. Look at verse 16 of John chapter 6. He tells us that when evening came, his disciples, that is Jesus' disciples, went down to the lake where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum, a town on the other side of the lake. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. Obviously, the disciples thought that Jesus was going to come. They knew that he had sent them on down ahead of him, but I mean, they kind of traveled everywhere with Jesus, and Jesus didn't normally stay too separated from them for too terribly long, and so they thought, well, I'm sure he's going to come down. But Jesus hasn't come join them, even though Jesus said, our plan is to go to the other side of the lake, across the Sea of Galilee. And it's gotten late. It's dark. It's late in the day. Remember, it was getting late in the day when Jesus performed the miracle, the sign of feeding the 5,000. That's why he said, hey, the people are getting hungry. The disciples are like, what are we going to do? Jesus is like, well, let's feed them. And so they did. So it's even later now. Jesus has sent the disciples away. They have gone on the way to Capernaum. And remember, it's about 12, 13 miles across, 7 or 8 miles wide, okay? About 140, 150 feet deep, 600, 700 feet below sea level. You're getting the picture, okay? Verse 18, I told you the Sea of Galilee is not always calm. Look at verse 18. A strong wind was blowing, and the waters grew rough. So Jesus says, we're going to go to the other side. You go on ahead of me. They set out on the Sea of Galilee, and a storm comes up. It was peaceful the day that I was there on the Sea of Galilee, but it's not always peaceful, and because there's something else about the geography of the Sea of Galilee that's important to note. It is surrounded by mountain ranges, all right? So the Golan Heights are there. There's other mountain ranges around. When you look at it, if you were to zoom way out, it would look like a dome or almost like an arena or like a cup, like a bowl, okay? Because down, it's low. It's the lowest freshwater lake in the world, okay? So it's below sea level, but there is mountainous regions around it. And so what that means is a lot of times storms would be unpredictable and they would just kind of pop up because the tall mountains around it, the air would cool and rush down from the mountains and collide with the warm air steaming up off the sea. This is a weather meteorological lesson for you, all right? This is, you're gonna get some science today, okay? And so when the cold air from the mountains is rushing down and meeting the warm air coming off of the lake, condensation would form, storms would form, wind would form, and the direction in which the disciples are going to the other side was not with the wind at their back. It was with the storm coming their way. And remember, if you're on the lake or you're on the sea and a storm comes up, I don't know if you've ever been in that situation. I've been in it a couple times. It's not like when a storm comes up and you're driving a car, all right? Because when a storm comes up and you're driving a car, like the road stays pretty flat. I mean, if it doesn't, you're in a real storm, okay? But the road pretty much stays put. But in the ocean or on the sea or on the lake, if there's a storm comes up, the waves are choppy and you are rocking, and not in a good sense. You are feeling sick and you are in danger, especially if you're caught in the middle of a storm on a boat without a motor. 2,000 years ago, the disciples, they didn't have a boat with a motor. They had a boat with some paddles. And so they're caught in the storm with paddles, not a motor, and all they could do was row. And they rowed. And after a while of rowing, especially when there's a storm, you get tired. And so the disciples are getting tired. They're working hard to make it to the other side. The other side that Jesus said, hey, that's where we're going. This is where we should go. And they're starting to get concerned about the storm. They are in a storm. And they weren't inexperienced. I mean, these are former fishermen. They made their living fishing before they left it all behind to follow Jesus. So they had seen storms before. They had probably seen storms pop up on this sea countless times, like, yeah, whatever, we'll make it to the other side before it becomes an issue, or hey, it'll blow over. But for this one, that's not what happened. Look at verse 19. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, so they're about a third, a fourth, almost a half of the way to the other side. They're in the middle of the lake. When they had rowed 3 or 4 miles, and Matthew tells us that actually it was about an 8 or 9 hours that they had been rowing. I mean, can you imagine? It shouldn't take them that long to get to the other side. They've just been rowing and rowing and rowing. And when they had rowed for about 8 or 9 hours, Matthew tells us, in the fourth watch of the night, and how they kept their calendar, okay, and their time. They had rowed 3 or 4 miles. They saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. That's right. This is that famous account that even if you don't know much about Jesus, or you're new to faith, or you're not sure what you believe, you've probably heard that Jesus one day walked on water. This is that account where Jesus does that. And they're rowing and rowing and rowing, and they're stuck in the middle. And then they see Jesus walking on the water, but they're frightened. And here's the question that I think we need to ask ourselves when we're going through this account. Like, why were they frightened? They were frightened because they didn't know it was Jesus. See, John is telling this account in retrospect, so he knew it was Jesus, but in the moment, they don't recognize it's Jesus. Matthew, in his account of the same situation, of the same event, tells us that they actually thought it was a ghost. What does that tell you? They thought they were gonna die. Because you don't think that you're seeing a ghost unless you're in an eerie, without hope situation, and it's getting kind of sketchy. It was getting kind of sketchy. They were frightened because they didn't know it was Jesus, and they were frightened because, can I just say this? People don't just walk on water. I mean, if you're on the boat, and there's a storm, and you look out and you see somebody walking, like, that is terrifying because people don't just do that every day. And I wanted you to know how deep the Sea of Galilee was. It's not as deep as the ocean. It's not as deep as other lakes, but it is deep enough that nobody could just say, oh, I bet there was just a drought and Jesus was walking on the bank. No, John is very clear to tell us that they were miles from the shore, so that for those that might doubt and wonder, well, did he really walk on water? He was walking on the water. There was no walking on the floor bed. This is not the parting of a sea where he's walking on dry land. No, he's walking on the water, and they were frightened by that because people don't just do that. And I don't know. I think we romanticize. Christians are the worst, romanticizing things, And I mean, I'm one, and you're one. So a lot of, so like just with me. But like a lot of our paintings in our houses, and like it looks so precious and like cleaned up, right? Like, if you ever seen pictures of the nativity, it's like, oh, so sweet. Like, Jesus was born in a stable. Like, it was stinky, it was smelly, it was not glamorous, right? But with Jesus walking on water, I just wonder, now maybe it happened like so oftentimes we envision it, where the storm is raging and there's just this clear path and there's this light and it's like, and Jesus is just walking calmly on the water. But I don't know if, maybe, we don't know. But might it be that the wind and the waves are just raging, and the reason they're so terrified, one of the reasons, is because they see a figure and they think it's a ghost because the waves are coming up and down. They're like, oh my goodness, is that a person? Oh, maybe not, the wave just covered. Oh no, it is again. And so like Jesus, what if Jesus is like walking on top of the waves? Not through them, there's a calm separation, but could you imagine if you see somebody walking and normally if you tried to swim, you'd be getting destroyed, but he's walking on top of the churn. He's walking on top of the chop. He's walking on top of the huge waves and through the wind and the rain and just everything is swirling and they see this figure, this ghostly looking figure, and they're like, what is happening? It's an eerie sight. It's an eerie situation. But notice what John tells us next in verse 20. He said to them, it is I. Don't be afraid. They're terrified. They think it's a ghost. They don't think it's Jesus. They don't know it's Jesus. But he speaks to them and says, it is I. Don't be afraid. I am here for you. The one that you've seen do all the signs, the 4 signs before this one, I'm here for you. I can be what you need for me to be for you in this moment. I'm here. You don't have to be afraid. Your heart doesn't have to be troubled. I know you're in despair. I know you've been rowing for hours. You think this storm is going to take you in. But you've seen me do other things. It is I. You don't have to be afraid. Verse 21, then, after they heard Jesus say that, then they were willing to take him into the boat. And immediately, the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Isn't that interesting? This is the shortest sign that John records for us. It's only about 6 verses long. But as soon as Jesus got into the boat, immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Translation, immediately the storm that was preventing them from reaching the other side stopped. As soon as Jesus got into the boat. So what does this reveal? Every sign reveals something to us about Jesus' identity. That Jesus was in command over the natural laws, the elements, the wind, the waves, the storms. We read in Colossians, the Apostle Paul says that he, being Jesus, is before all things, and in him all things hold together, that all things have been created through him and for him and by him. He's in power over this because he's the one that created the world. Why is Jesus able to just stop a storm? Because he's more powerful than it. Which once again, this shows us Jesus is not just another man. He's not just a good man. He's not just a godly man. He's not just a prophet. He is the Son of God, the Messiah, the long-awaited anointed one to come. He is God. A storm is nothing for Jesus. Get this, the very thing that was about to kill them and do them in, and all of them in the boat. Come on, there's like 12 of them, right, that are in the boat at least rowing hard to overpower the waves. And the waves that were about to overpower 12 of them, Jesus could walk on top of them. Like the waves are no match for Jesus. Him walking on top of the water, this is why I think it was likely not calm, that it was waves, was to show them that the thing that you're fearing, I can walk on top of. It's the ultimate stiff arm, right? You know what a stiff arm is in football? It's like when a running back's running. Derrick Henry, as we miss him so much, leaving Tennessee, right? Derrick, he was so good at it. He would just put his arm out, which is as big as my thigh with muscle, right? And he would just like, nope, not today. And people would just fall on the ground. It was awesome. I loved when he would stiff arm people. The greatest running backs they have huge biceps and they have really strong arms and they stiff arm. Like, that's what Jesus's walking on water was. It was a stiff arm to the belief that these waves could do us in and that these waves might be more powerful than even God. He was able to just walk on them, walk on top of them, and just show who he was. A storm is nothing for Jesus. So what should this sign do? What should seeing this sign do for all of us? It should do the same thing that has happened each and every week we've looked at a sign. It should cause you to believe in Jesus. Not just that he exists, but that trusting him with your life is worth it, because who else could do this? No one else could do this. And after this account, after they bring Jesus into their boat and the storm calms down, do you know what Matthew says the disciples did? He says they worshiped. Because there's no other response than truly believing in who Jesus is and worshiping him when you realize that no one else could do this. He is alone worthy of my whole life. This sign once again reveals who Jesus is. He's greater than the storms. But there's a couple takeaways that I want to, every week I try to show us, what does this show us about his identity, and then how do we apply this to our lives? Like, what's the takeaway for us in the 21st century? Like what can we take away? And I want to do a couple takeaways by asking you a couple questions. Here's the first takeaway. If Jesus was more powerful than the storm, and that's what this sign shows, why did he let them go into it? Then struggle for hours before intervening. Okay, so we see this sign, we see who Jesus is based on how he is more powerful than nature. Nothing is greater than him. He can even control the storms, the wind, the waves. Okay, but why? Like if he's that powerful, why did he let them go through the storm? And then why did he wait for hours and let them struggle to intervene? Have you ever struggled with that? Maybe you walked in this morning and you're going through a storm. Maybe you walked in this morning and you're going through something, or maybe you've been in something for a long time. And if this is true about Jesus' power, then you would be right to look at me and say, well, Matt, if he's that strong, he could have prevented me from going through what I'm going through. And you're right. He could have. So if he's that strong, why is it that he allows us to go through it and then he doesn't intervene? Why the struggle? Well, here's what we know. When you ask questions like this, it's so important to not try to answer what you don't know, but to focus on what you do know. What we do know is that God is not the author of sin and evil. And what we also know is that in the future, he's gonna put an end to all the storms of life. But just like the disciples, we live caught in the middle. Just like the disciples who are on one side and Jesus is like, let's go to that side. They get caught in the middle, just like you may feel right now, just like you walked in here this morning with something going on in your life. And you're like, I feel like I'm caught in the middle. I'm going through a storm. I'm going through something that I would never have chosen for myself. So God, if you're strong enough to keep me from it, and you're strong enough to take me out of it right now, why am I still in it? And the truth is, I don't know. I don't know definitively why. Because God could, and God has, and God might. And God has intervened in your life before. So I don't know exactly why right now, but what I do know is that there are certain things that until you get to the end of yourself, you won't look to God. And if He rescued you before getting to that point, your faith would not be stretched. This was a test for the disciples. I'm not saying that's what you're going through, but for the disciples, this was a test for them. How long were they going to keep rowing and trying to fix their situation before they considered outside intervention? See, when you're going through a storm, you will be tempted. I've talked to a lot of people in my life. In my line of work, there's a lot of times that people look to me to help interpret what they're going through. And a lot of times people are saying, why? Like, why is it that God would let me go through this? And basically what they are saying is, I view going through a storm as God's indifference towards me or His absence with me. When you go through a storm, when I go through a storm, it's natural to ask that. But rather than asking that, ask yourself the question, God, how can I trust you more in this? And how do you want to grow me through it? It's incredibly difficult to ask that question. It's much easier to ask that in retrospect, and it's much easier to see it looking backwards. But in the moment, if you're tempted to doubt God's presence in your life, just know it's not because He's absent. It's not because He's indifferent. Going through a storm does not mean that He's absent or indifferent. It might be that He's wanting to do something in you. I think about this when I think about teaching my kids to swim. I take an old school approach to teaching my kids to swim. No floaties. Why do you need floaties? We lived in Florida for the first several years when my kids were growing up. And in Florida, it's hot. There's 4 seasons, like hot, hotter, hottest, and then back to hot, all right? There's no nice seasons like here in Tennessee, okay? And so you swim year round, like no problem. So that meant you got to teach your kids to swim. Like everybody pretty much knows how to swim at a young age if they're around a pool, especially because you don't want your kids falling in because they're always around water. And so I took it upon myself to say, hey, we're going to teach our kids to swim. And so I did what my dad did for me. I threw my kids in. And here's what happens. Let me just tell you what happens if you want to take this approach. What happens when you throw your kids in? They will move their arms and legs, and they will think they're drowning. But eventually, at least in my experience, their flailing arms and legs will start to get coordinated. But in all seriousness, here's the thing. My kids thought I was killing them, right? They thought Dad didn't care. They thought Dad wasn't trying to help them. And after a while, what I would do is after they could get their arms coordinated, and by the way, they're all still alive. I haven't lost one yet, okay? After I realized, okay, this is not working, I would jump in and I would grab them and I would pull them to the side. And then after doing this for several times, what would I do is I would go out and I would say, hey, you jump in yourself now and swim to me. And what would they do? They would jump in and they would think I was only 5 feet away. And as they went under and then popped up, I was now 10 feet away. Why did I do that? Not because I'm cruel, but because I wanted to teach them to swim. right? They wanted me to remove them from the situation. They felt like they were going through a storm. They were going through adversity. They didn't want to do what I knew would teach them to swim quicker than anything else. They wanted me to remove them from the situation. But they didn't need me to remove them from the storm that they were in learning how to swim. What they needed was to know that I was with them. They didn't need me to remove them from the storm of learning how to swim. They just needed to know that they could trust their dad, that if I'm near them, I won't let them be overtaken. I'll be right there to catch you. Just keep swimming. What if God doesn't want to remove you from your situation and you're so focused on getting past it that you miss what God wants to do in you and through you in the midst of it? See, so often we're so focused on avoiding storms or having them go away when we're in the midst of it that we don't realize that God wants to do something in the midst of them before he removes them. He wants to strengthen our faith. And I'm not saying that is absolutely your situation, but I'm saying it might be, and that was what was going on for the disciples. So often we don't need God to remove the storm as much as to see his presence within the storm. A storm-free life without God's presence is worse than a storm with his presence. You need God's presence, but so often we don't experience his presence because we don't look for him. Here's the second question that I want to ask that'll help us know the second takeaway from this sign. And it's this: why didn't the disciples recognize Jesus? Like, they had just been with him. You ever thought about that? They were just with him hours before. Like, why didn't they recognize Jesus? I mean, yeah, it could be that it was storming. It was like, I don't know. But they thought it was a ghost. You want to know the main reason they didn't recognize Jesus? Because they weren't looking for him. You can't experience God's presence in your life when you're going through a storm if you aren't looking for him. He's right there. He's here this morning. He's available to you no matter the storm you're going through. But so often, like the disciples, we're in the midst of a storm and we don't see Jesus because we're not looking for him. And why do we not look for him? Because we don't expect him to show up, or we don't think he can handle what we're going through. So what do we do instead? We row. We row. We row. We row. Yeah, but I got to get through this. This is awful. I can't believe I'm experiencing this. I got to get through this. And instead of looking to Jesus and experiencing him in the midst of your storm, you focus, and I get it. I've been there. I've done it. We focus on rowing to get through it. We either row by worrying about it, or we row by working hard to get through it. But notice, Jesus wasn't in a hurry to get to the disciples. He knew the storm was coming before they set off. And he knew how long they had been rowing when he walked up. And notice, John doesn't tell us he ran to them. He walked on the water. He wasn't in a rush. Jesus came calmly and without worry because he wanted them to realize that he could stop this in an instant. So often, we don't get to the place of experiencing his presence and his peace in the midst of storms when we're going through them because we do not take time to look for him in the storm. But I'm here to promise you that whatever the other side of the storm that you're going through that you need to get to will only be possible if you look to Jesus and let him in the boat of your life. I'm not here this morning to promise you that if you've just gotten a diagnosis, that if you just look to Jesus, he'll take it away. He can. We've seen every week he's powerful enough to do that. He could do that. But I'm not selling that this morning because I'm not God. But what I do know is if you're in the midst of a storm right now, again, Jesus with you is better than no storm without Jesus. Jesus with you in the midst of your storm will bring you peace that cannot be found without him. Jesus with you in the midst of your storm will do something for you that nothing else can. Maybe you got a phone call this week and your life is just raging. Maybe you got a text this week. Maybe there's something going on in your marriage. Maybe there's something going on financially in your life. Maybe there's something going on with a close friend or a family member, and it feels like life is out of control. And if you feel that way, that's natural. It's because it's real to you. But the solution is not to keep rowing. The solution is not to try to work your way through it in your own strength because you cannot do it. You cannot overcome and overpower the storms in this life just by thinking better or trying harder. And worrying will not deliver what you think it will and what we so often think it does by evidence of how often we do that. But when you go through a storm, and maybe you walked in here this morning in the midst of a storm, if you slow down and look to Jesus, invite him into it, you will experience a peace that surpasses understanding in the midst of the storm. You will be able to experience and relate to a God who knows you and loves you and wants to be there for you in ways that trying to do it without him, you would miss out on completely. Whatever storm you might be in right now, and storms come in all shapes and sizes. A storm for you would be like a walk in the park to me, because we're all different. And a storm for me, you may laugh at and say, why is that bothering you? Storms are not equal. A storm is simply anything that you go through and you feel like you can't get through it. A storm is simply anything you go through or that you're experiencing right now and you're like, it is a big thing and I don't know how to get to the other side of it. So what should you do when you're in the midst of the storm? What should you do when you're in the midst of a storm and you've been working hard and you've been worrying? You should look to Jesus and invite him into it. And then trust him with the results. If right now the storm you're going through, you feel like God has forgotten you, you feel like God has forsaken you, the disciples felt the same way. But Jesus was just on the bank of the sea. And as we've seen throughout this series, time and distance are nothing for him. So whatever you're going through right now, no matter how much you have kept him at a distance, no matter how much you have doubted his presence, no matter how much you have doubted whether he cares, in an instant, you can invite him into it. And I promise you this, I can't promise you that if you invite him into your situation that it'll go away. But I can promise you that inviting Jesus into your situation will invite him in. His presence will be real. He will not forsake you. He never has. He will be present with you. And again, Jesus in the midst of a storm with you is always better than no storms without him. So here's what I want to do. I just want to give us a second just to pray together. Would you just bow your heads and close your eyes with me? If you're in here right now, you're watching online, and you aren't in the midst of a storm, like you that's just not you. You didn't come in here in the midst of a storm. Then would you just right now, would you just pray for those in this room, those watching online that may be in the midst of a storm? Would you just pray for them right now? Pray that they would look to Jesus. If you're in the midst of a storm right now, and again, they come in all shapes and sizes. It's simply anything that stands between you and what you feel like is where God desires for you to be, or what you've planned, or what you want, or just it's brokenness in front of you. If you're in the midst of a storm right now, would you just ask Jesus to be present in your life right now? He knows what you're going through. Tell him you don't want to try to fix it on your own, and you don't want to worry about it. You just want him to be present with you. Now ask him to fix it. We've seen that he can do anything. Maybe you're in a situation and you just got a diagnosis, or someone close to you has just got a diagnosis. Ask him to heal. Maybe you have a relational situation, a family or a friend situation. Ask God to intervene. Maybe you're on the other side of it already, and that person has passed away, or the relationship has ended, but you're still burdened, and the storm right now that you're in is grief. The storm right now that you're in is just a burden. God, just ask God to be with you right now. Ask God to help you believe that the storm that you're in doesn't mean he's absent or indifferent. Tell him you're going to choose to believe that he's near enough to do something about your situation. And now just ask him to help you trust him. Regardless of if he takes the storm away or if the storm persists, tell him you're going to trust him and that you want him more than you want your storm to go away. That's a hard prayer. Pray right now that you want him more than your storm to go away, and that you're just going to trust him with the results. Father, you have never left us. You have never forsaken us. Even if it feels like that at times, even if it feels like that right now in our lives with the storms that we're going through. But Lord, I don't believe you make mistakes. You knew who was going to be watching this message at home right now. You knew the people that were going to be here in person this morning listening to this message. You knew that we were going to be on the fifth sign on this Sunday. And Lord, this sign reveals something so clear about who you are. God, would you help us to trust you? If we're going through a storm, would we lean in and know that you've never forsaken us and that you are here? We can't face it on our own. We're not enough. We're not strong enough. But with you, we can. Lord, if there's anyone here this morning that this sign is what did it for them, it moved them from unbelief to belief and they're ready to trust you, would they do that this morning? God, if any of us need to make a decision for Jesus this morning, would we do so without leaving? Father, as there are leaders that will be here at the front during this next song, God, if there's anyone that needs to come to these steps, if there's anyone that needs to come to someone and say, hey, I need to talk, I need you to pray for me to have strength and to trust Jesus through the storm. If there's anyone that's here that says, I'm ready to go all in with Jesus. I've been thinking that my storm prevents me from following him fully, but I'm ready. I'm ready to give him my life. I'm ready to go all in. God, whatever decision we need to make, would we just step out and step into what you would have for us this morning? So God, during this next song, would we just process what decision you need us to make? And would we be like the disciples that after the storm paused, they worshiped you because they realized that you were greater than their storm? Help us this morning to come to that same place. In Jesus' name, amen.